The image of the distressed female most likely to linger in memory is the image of the one who did not die, the survivor or final girl. She is the one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror of her own peril, who is chased, cornered, wounded, whom we see scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. She is abject terror personified. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is a No Fear Cast, a podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 16 of season 5, and we are starting a new series all about horror's final girls.
So as Lisa said in the intro, we are covering the final girl for our next series of episodes. And Lisa's reading of that quote was from Carol Clover, probably one of the preeminent authorities on final girls. She was actually the one who sort of coined the term final girl in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And so we kind of have her to thank for this addition to the horror lexicon. And so we're kind of going to spend this episode talking about kind of the history of the final girl, kind of some of its proto origins and up through it kind of big peak and heyday. But for those of you that aren't really familiar with the final girl, it is the concept of, well, think Halloween. The original Halloween movie is the prototypical example, but there were definitely movies that preceded it, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I believe Black Christmas, I think, was before Halloween as well. But it's, this 1970s slasher movie where you have a final survivor facing off against the killer, and in this case it's almost always a woman, and she is the final girl. So again, just think Laurie Strode in Halloween, and there's a lot of characteristics of the final girl which I think we'll cover probably a bit more in depth as this episode progresses. But a lot of the stereotypes are that they are often asexual, or at least virginal, or at least not interested in sex like their friends are. They're a bit more book smarts and observant. They typically will refrain from drug or alcohol use in the movie while their other friends are taking part in those sorts of things. And one thing that I thought was interesting, that I believe it was Carol Clover that initially pointed out, that they are a more keen observer than a lot of their friends. And some of that may be due to them being more clear-headed and not drunk or stoned or whatever. But it is definitely a characteristic of the final girl. So I kind of actually was thinking in preparation for this that, I'm sitting here co-hosting this with two other women on this thing. So I wanted to get your input on the final girls, and really, well, Mel, Lisa, just kind of ask, what was like your first kind of encounter with the idea of the final girl? Because it wasn't something I was aware of until long after I started watching horror movies. Within the last 10, 15 years probably was when I first encountered the term. So, if you don't mind sharing, what have been your encounters with it?
Well, I guess I'll start. I feel like Lisa's going to have more to say about this than me, actually. Listeners, if you've heard interviews with me in the past elsewhere, or even this piece I wrote last year on why I love horror for Becky Stratford, you know that my kind of initiation into horror did not have to do with the slasher film. And the slasher film is still something that I'm not extremely knowledgeable about when it comes to horror tropes and genres. I came into horror kind of sideways, I like to joke, because I kind of avoided those films and was more into supernatural things. So for me, I feel like the series is going to be me kind of reading up on this and learning more than maybe some episodes are like really in my wheelhouse. I have to say, because of my relative ignorance of slasher films, except for occasionally catching them when I was maybe at someone's house or flipping through channels, the final girl didn't really come to my attention probably until maybe around the time she came to yours, Matt. I think I was like in college or grad school and people were talking about this. I want to say I for sure was hearing about it when some friends of mine were taking a horror movie class in grad school, and they were talking about gender in that class and talking about Carol Clover. And so she came to my attention at that point. But yeah, I mean, other than knowing kind of the gist of a slasher, for example, like you said, like Halloween, and having a feel for the fact that these women or Texas Chainsaw Massacre are the ones who end up at the end. Like I knew that, I guess, in the back of my mind, but I never really sat down and thought about like what all the characteristics were or about the term per se until I got into more, I guess, I would say academic settings. I don't know, Lisa, maybe you even told me about it for all I know, but it would have been around that time when I first started to kind of be thinking in that direction. So Lisa, like I said, you're much more probably have much more experience with this, or maybe like have thought about it a little bit more. I know you've talked about it before when we've chatted about it. So what is your first time hearing about the final girl, or your kind of, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like ramp up to it, maybe, because I know we are going to talk about the history of the term. But what's your experience?
Oh man, I feel like I was really interested in the idea of the final girl, and I knew the term well before I knew about Carol Clover's theory surrounding it. Like because I came to it. I will say maybe around like high school, because that's when I really started watching slashers avidly. I it I was always terrified of horror movies as a kid, but also equally fascinated by them. And I I think even as a kid, because probably like a lot of diehard like adult horror fans, talking to people, most of us I feel like have a story where it's like I watched The Exorcist when I was way too young, and then I was horrified and hooked. um, which was definitely my introduction to horror. You know, I started watching old Vincent Price movies with my grandmother. House of Wax in particular was one of my favorites, and I was super young when I was watching those. And you know, I was fascinated by the idea of, in that movie in particular, where Vincent Price's character runs this wax museum and he has an obsession with like preserving beautiful women. And that always stood out to me, but I don't know if I could articulate it because I was really young. And then I would say maybe around 11 or 12 was the first time I watched like a proper horror movie. Or maybe it was before that. I will say the one that got me hooked was The Exorcist. Before that, I think I had watched a Stephen King movie. But I was around 11 or 12 and I watched An Exorcist over at a friend's house. And again, you had a really young girl, and where all the horror was being like enacted on her. And again, I didn't have like the academic prowess at that point to really put it together. And I didn't come to like, you know, like I said, like Men, Women's Chainsaws, all of that didn't come until much later when I was in graduate school, where I started actually thinking, oh, I could watch these horror movies and turn it into quote unquote work, where I can write about it in academic papers and call it, you know, what I can call that schoolwork and do that for fun. But I would say in high school is where I really started to pay attention to the idea of the final girl, because, and I honestly don't remember when the term came to me or who told it to me first, but somebody had pointed out that not only are women traditionally the victims of a male killer in these type of like slashers, but also there's usually one who's like chosen to survive until the end. And I found that absolutely fascinating. I was also around this time really into urban legends, so I was kind of collecting these stories that like people would tell. And again, somebody pointed out to me that urban legends, like horror films, tend to have this narrative of don't like in order to be a final girl, in order to be a survivor, you not only need to be smarter than your peers, and you need to be more observant than your peers, but there was also this idea of like purity and innocence and like sexual purity, but also like a mental purity, because I think one of you, Matt, maybe it was you when you were talking about it, the idea of, or Mel, I don't remember now. Sorry. Where was the idea of like, everybody else is off doing drugs and drinking and smoking pot and having sex and doing all the things typical teenagers do, but there's the one who's different. And maybe that's the reason she's paying attention. But whatever it is, there was this idea of like, of a purity that was attached to it, which I thought was really fascinating. And so I think that was kind of my introduction to it. It was a really long and winding road because, it was something that I was aware of, but I didn't really start researching in any sort of way until I was in graduate school. And I realized that was a thing you could do, was apply this like film theory to it and this gender theory and kind of come up with some really interesting things. And then I started paying real attention to what filmmakers were doing. Because then by the time I was a teenager, Scream was already out at that point. And so everything was kind of changing rapidly with the idea of the final girl. But I don't know, it's always been something I'm fascinated about. And honestly, it kind of shocks me that it's taken this long for us to discuss really the final girl this long in the podcast, because I feel like she is such an integral part of the horror genre.
Yeah, it's season 5, and we're just now getting to it.
Which is
Well, to be
I
fair,
think that we've had a lot to talk about, though, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff out there.
yeah.
we have, and it did take us many seasons before we actually got to creepy kids. So
That's true.
But no, I agree with you, Lisa, what you're saying about it being an integral part of the horror genre. And it when I first stumbled across the idea of it, and I mean, I think Scream would probably have been my first, and probably yours as well, exposure to it, just as an idea. But I didn't have the phrase "the final girl" until years later, after I first saw Scream. But once like I heard it, I was like, it just clicked. I was like, oh, that's in so many things. It's like, it's not just slasher films, but that's kind of the big thing that you can point towards. But yeah, it is an integral part of horror as we know it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of feel like at this point we need to talk about, I mean, obviously we're going to be speaking a lot about Carol Clover's book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And I will probably put a little asterisk on this discussion and say that, I don't know, I feel like this is one of those texts that everybody needs to read if you're really into like horror theory. But it was also written in 1992. And so I feel like it needs an update because so much has happened since it was published that, yeah, I kept thinking that doing a reread of this book was that, oh man, I wish there was, and I don't think there has been. I guess I have a new edition of it, but I don't think it's ever been really updated, which is kind of fascinating. But I do think it's important that we talk about not only who the final girl is, but where she got her start. So we've already kind of covered a little bit about who the final girl is, but before we really get into the nitty gritty of who she is, I feel like we need to talk about where this idea starts from. And I am completely pulling this from Carol Clover's book. She talks about the final girl not only in relation to horror, but specifically in relation to the slasher film. And I think that is a good place to start as any, because even though there are other final girls in other types of horror films, I feel like when we talk about, like a Laurie Strode or something like Scream, then you do have to kind of talk about the slasher film. So we probably need, and again, I can't believe we really haven't discussed slashers in any sort of real in-depth. I mean, I'm sure the idea has come up, but talking about like just the slasher film in particular, because that's really where the genesis of this is. And Clover in her book really, well, she actually calls it the appointed ancestor of the slasher film. She pinpoints Hitchcock's Psycho, which came out in 1960, as being like kind of the prototype for the slasher film, but also where this idea of the final girl is born as we know her, kind of the way we experience her in film. Certainly, I think you could go back further in literature and find influences or characters that share the same like thematic things as some of these final girls. But she really pinpoints Psycho as it. And this is one of the things that she points out. She says, first, you have a male killer that is a product of a sick family. The killer, she points out, is not always fully masculine. Again, we're going to be using terms like masculine and feminine a lot in this that we're pulling from Clover's book. This is where I also think it really needs an update, because I think in 2021, gender is expressed so differently, and we have such a different understanding of how like gender works than the way she talks about it in her book. But we're just going to kind of be, I don't know. When I'm using these terms, I'm pulling it from Clover's theory. So I'm just putting that footnote on this discussion. But she talks about how there's usually a killer who is male, but like doesn't present entirely as masculine, who is the product of some sort of sick family. So there's issues with the family unit usually. And then the victim is going to be a beautiful woman. Now, in the case of Psycho, she's a sexually active woman, which I feel like deviates from what we get in like the 80s. But you have this woman. She points out that typically the woman is not going to present as what we would understand as feminine, or as Clover puts in the book, the final girl in some way stands out from the other girls in the film. So the other girls she surrounds herself with. So like if they're all, kind of sexually active and more interested in boys, then our final girl has to somehow differentiate from that. So she has to stand out in some sort of way with like the other pack of girls. She also points out that the weapon cannot be a gun in a slasher film. This is really interesting, where I feel like we're going to have this debate at some point, but that's kind of what makes it a slasher, is that it's not going to be a gun. It's going to be usually a knife of some sort. And she, I think at some point points out like the phallic imagery of that. But, and then that the attack is usually very sudden, and that we will experience it usually through, you'll get the point of view of the killer, but you'll also experience the attack through the point of view of the victim. So of the final girl. So obviously in Psycho, there's that infamous shower scene, which I think even though the camera is giving you the point of view of the killer, the audience in some way experiences it through the eyes of the victim. And it's the same way, like I think about the closet scene in the first Halloween movie, kind of mirroring that shower scene in Psycho. So this is where she's pulling it from. She also talks about when you're looking at the earliest films in the transformation of the final girl, or at least like her early history, she points out, well, we've already mentioned Halloween is kind of the big one. But also around the same time, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then Friday the 13th. So those are all kind of prime slasher films that follow that Psycho map a little bit. So you have, you know, the sick family, you have the male killer that doesn't always kind of fit in with other men. You have a girl who maybe even boyish. That's another one of Clover's terms, where she says, just as the killer is not fully masculine, the final girl is not fully feminine. So I don't know. Coming from that, can y'all think of instances? I don't know, because I really feel like Psycho and Halloween are really kind of the two, if you're looking at the final girl, are the two films that have to be discussed. I can't think of any earlier than Psycho, honestly.
I can't either, and I tried. I kept thinking that there had to be some sort of maybe classic horror movie that verged on it, and there's got to be. I mean, there have been like the dark, isolated house movies. There's this older one. I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but the family was dysfunctional and the father supposedly died, and they all come to hear his horrible thoughts about them in the will, and they have to like survive in the house or something, and there's a dude dressed all in black with a knife, and they all one by one keep getting picked off in the house. But like I don't remember like the complicated gender aspect that Clover's talking about with a woman being left. I think it was probably, if I'm remembering right, a man and a woman, because you had that like there's a kind of almost like a romance maybe at the end of it, or like the survivors will go off together. I'm having a hard time thinking of classic horror movies that would follow necessarily that idea. I mean, there's Straight Jacket was a castle movie, but that was playing off of Psycho. So that would have been like a year after. I don't know. I mean, I've asked you this before, Lisa, but do you feel like the really early Gothic novels play around with this idea of gender that Clover is identifying? Like a certain type of woman is being pursued in a violent manner and survives, or no?
Yeah, this is a complicated question for me, because part of me is like, well, of course. Of course this is drawing from the Gothic tradition. I mean, because in the Gothic tradition, you do have a woman who is usually set aside from her peers. Usually it's because she is smart and she is more observant. So she's not given to fears, because of course, when you're looking at the Gothic novel, especially in like the vein of Anne Radcliffe, you have women who are experiencing supernatural occurrences, but are smart enough and observant enough to realize that things are not always as they seem. And so that kind of plays into Anne Radcliffe's explains supernatural phenomenon. And then usually, and this again is Radcliffe, not always, but usually they're very virtuous. So you usually see them either connecting very strongly with nature and wanting to like preserve nature, or they're very virtuous in that while everybody else is like running off to the city and enjoying every vice that they can enjoy, but she won't, because she's going to stay at home. I mean, the Gothic heroine is always somebody usually who's a caretaker. So I'm thinking of like the Mysteries of Udolpho, where the heroine is presented as very close to her father, and because her mother isn't around anymore, she's kind of there taking care of her father. And that ends up being one of their virtues, is that they want to take care of other people, and they're very closely connected to family. And when now that I think about it, because when you look at something like Halloween, what is Laurie Strode doing throughout the course of the movie? She's babysitting while all of her friends are kind of out partying. And I feel like you get that in other ways. Even the Texas Chainsaw or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original movie. Oh, what's the character's name? Sally. Where she is presented as a caretaker of her brother, who's the one in the wheelchair, right? And part of the reason that they were in Texas, like in that part of Texas to begin with, is because she had heard that her grandfather's grave might have been vandalized and she wanted to check it out. So that's part of the reason why they're like out there having this, because it's kind of a road trip movie, but she is presented as very much of a caretaker. Like she's worried about people and she wants to take care of things, and she wants to make sure that like her family in particular are taken care of. So that is one, I don't know, that's one of the interesting things that honestly I hadn't thought about until right now, where I feel like that's a direct parallel. Yeah. I think you can make an argument with the Gothic novel. I was honestly thinking more about like Edgar Allan Poe and drawing a line from the way he perceives kind of this male gaze of the final girl, and the way because in her virtue she's also usually young and beautiful. And I mean, you can't talk about Poe, I feel like, without talking about when he wrote about the death of a beautiful woman being the most poetical topic in the world. And mainly because you get the mourning lover and the kind of what he saw as this like extremely sad, beautiful idea of this. And in a way, I feel like you get that with the final girl in slasher films too, is this idea that it has to be a young, beautiful, virtuous woman in order for it to like elevate it in some sort of way. But again, that's all very kind of the male gaze of it all. So yeah, I think you could make an argument that the final girl owes a lot to the Gothic novels and Gothic heroines.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned the male gaze part of it, because that is something that I did want to bring up at some point, and this feels like a natural segue, not to just completely turn away from the Gothic part, but one thing that I found pretty fascinating, and I think is a real important part of the final girl, is that she is both kind of an object of a male gaze, but also kind of inverts that. And I believe Clover was the one that pointed this out first, is that the audience, including the men in the audience, are forced to identify with her, the woman in the climax of the movie. And so the makers of the horror films are kind of wanting everyone, including men, to experience the terror in the climax. And so, well, like I said, men are forced to see that through the female gaze. So not to say that the original incarnation of the final girl is not, it definitely is a misogynistic thing, but it, even at its early stages, it's starting to play with and undermine that misogyny by forcing the male gaze to kind of shift and identify with a woman.
Yeah, I did think that was interesting when I was looking over Clover for this episode. Well, I saw several things interesting, and I just want to say, Lisa, I thought your connection to Poe was really, really cool. I had not thought about that, but yeah, the death of the beautiful woman works perfectly. But yeah, it seems like the final girl, and the way that Clover talks about it and the way you think about it, just like you were saying, Matt, has so many different kind of moving parts that don't always necessarily work together. Like it seems like some of what we're talking about is policing women's sexuality just because of the people who get quote unquote punished. But then at the same time, you have these like pure characters, maybe even almost otherworldly kind of pure characters that make it till the end. You know, some of those Gothic heroines that the targets were usually virginal, as you were saying, Lisa, and very, I guess, you know, caretaker, motherly, those sorts of things. But then, you know, like Clover saying, and like you're saying, Matt, they're also playing with the gaze of the audience. You know, Clover says that societally, we kind of hooked females or women, the feminine, as I guess Clover would say, to abject terror. She's like, if you think of abject terror in a movie, you're thinking of a woman screaming or being pursued or violated, which is pretty horrifying that would be like a shorthand. But yes, she's like, the men usually get killed rather quickly. But how do you then get all your audience members to watch a movie if you're going to focus on a woman? There were men reading Gothic fiction, but maybe more women. More women probably read Gothic romance in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But you do this what Clover talks about is androgynous, where the final girl is like, I guess the quote unquote, I'm using this language and I'm not 100% comfortable with, but like she is like the good aspects of femininity, but then she also is androgynous from her name to her her way of being able to be in abject terror, but at the same time also use something to protect herself. That idea of grabbing the phallic object, or using the hanger, using the knife, or whatever comes to hand, a chainsaw, whatever, to kind of turn the tables. And she says at the end of the movie, they're almost interchangeable because the woman has this kind of like power that she almost took from the person who was pursuing her, so that she could almost go in like one of two ways. So I don't even know what that means, because I mean, then you have the whole problem of what happens to the final girl after the movie's done. But I don't know. I think what I'm saying is I feel like it's still kind of like a trope and an object, and not necessarily trying to look at the female character as how can I say this? Like how maybe a woman would react, like a complex character. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like there's all these different avenues and layers of interpretation, how the reader or the watcher will interpret it, what we need to do to build a bridge to that person. And here's a type. Whereas maybe later, as we get closer to today, perhaps maybe that will be part of our twist, that these characters maybe become a little bit more complex than that.
Here's here's the weird thing about the final girl, and you're right, Mel, and kind of hinting that she gets a lot more complicated. I think as the years roll on, and I'm sure it won't be too much of a spoiler to say we're definitely going to get there at some point in our discussion of her. But, when I was first, okay, Matt, you started out by asking us, like, when we first were aware of the idea of the final girl. And I think back, because it may have gone back to like Scream for me, when I really started thinking about, oh yeah, she's been in like every movie I've watched. I just didn't have a name for her before. But when I remember when I was aware of her and I was thinking back to these movies that I loved, and I did have this idea of, oh, yeah, got it. This is just like all these slasher movies of the 70s and 80s that I ended up loving. Oh, okay. They were just like thinly veiled messages to teenagers to not have sex and not do drugs. Right? Because and Clover points it out in her book, that they're the ones who usually are killed first. Usually it's the promiscuous girl that gets killed first. I'm thinking of like the Friday the 13th 13 movies in particular, like where you just had masses of teenagers that were just kind of there, no characterization even in some of these films, where they were just there to be kind of mowed down by the killer. And you could almost identify when you started watching, like which were going to be the teenagers who were going to last the longest in the film that you were supposed to kind of connect with. And then the others, you were just like, oh, okay, they're going to get killed really quickly because they went off to have sex, or, they're all drinking, or they're ignoring their maternal instincts. They're the bad caretakers because they're supposed to be watching these children out of camp, but they're not. And I mean, that's the whole point of Friday the 13th. Like, it's the mom getting revenge for her son's death. And then of course it turns into like the supernatural killer in the sequels. But what is really interesting is when I think about, now that I'm thinking about it, because I did connect it to the graphic novels, the Gothic novels. But then I think about what Carol Clover brought up with Psycho. and how that is kind of the prototype for the slasher film. And so if we're looking at it that way, then it's also kind of the prototype for the final girl, even though she doesn't make it through the film. But in that case, you know, she is not your typical, what we would think of as kind of the good female, right? She's run off, she's committed a crime, and so I guess she's supposed to be punished. But and I don't know if she talks about it in the book. I can't remember now, but I'm gonna go back and look, because Carol Clover jumps pretty quickly from Psycho to start talking about Halloween as giving us, really, this is where the final girl originated. But then I think before Halloween, because when was Halloween? Halloween was 1978, right? But whenever somebody talks about Halloween, I always want to talk about Black Christmas, because that came out in 1974. And it was very much the, like, Halloween before Halloween, right? And that is definitely a slasher film. And that is pulled straight from this kind of model of urban legends, which I see the final girl sharing as much with the tradition of urban legends as I do with, like, Gothic novels, for instance. And in that one, you have a final girl who is presented as smart and astute. I will acknowledge that we don't know totally if she's a final girl, and maybe that's why, like, Halloween is usually pinpointed as Laurie Strode is the original kind of final girl, because in the end of Black Christmas, it's ambiguous. Like, we don't know if she really got away or if she's really going to be okay, because the killer is still, I guess, out there. But as far as we know, she's alive at the end of the film. And you get a character who shares, kind of like with Laurie and some of the other final girls, she has the more masculine name, like, or ambiguous, gender ambiguous, I guess. I'm like you, Mel. I have trouble with some of these terms because I feel like they're outdated, but her name is Jess. And so that's not traditionally a feminine name, but she also is a standout because before the killings start, or like in the beginning of the film, she's talking to her boyfriend in that now famous speech where she says that she's pregnant and she doesn't want to get married because that's basically going to be the end of her freedom, and, like, that's nothing that she ever wanted, and that she's planning on getting an abortion, and she's the one who survives and fights to the end. So it almost feels like, I don't know, it's weird that the final girl, from her inception, seems to have almost swung more conservative in the initial years in a very strange way. I feel like in the early, 70s, when we really saw the slasher films starting to pick up, she wasn't as, like, kind of pure and innocent as we assume she is. Like, that really didn't start to happen until the 80s, where you really had this, like, this moral message attached to it. So I don't know. She's I think a lot more complicated than we even give her credit for, even early on. So I don't know. I find that really interesting. I'm looking, by the way, in the book. I don't think Carol Clover ever discusses Black Christmas, which is kind of strange to me.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up. The fact that the Black Christmas character is so much more complicated, and Clover doesn't really mention her. If she does, it's really quickly.
No, it's not in the index. I'll say that, and I don't remember coming across it.
That isn't interesting that the 80s would turn it. I don't know. Maybe part of the reason Clover didn't really talk about it, and some people don't think it's a final girl, is not just because the dude might still be in the building, but because of the character herself. Like, you consciously or unconsciously take, if it doesn't match the other cases, right? You pull that example. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I don't know. I know we're starting to run long on this. So I may be the one to kind of put put a pin in this. I do want to point out a couple of things that are happening around this time too, especially since we're talking about the Carol Clover book, because I'm really excited now that we've brought up Black Christmas and kind of shown how she's already starting to, the final girl, she is already starting to like be really complicated and not as easy as we'd like to think. One of the things that I love about Final Girls, and I think this is one thing that always drew me to horror early on, is that part of the Final Girls storyline is that she is a survivor and that she is a fighter. Now, what happens to her after the film, like you talked about, Mel, that's yet to be seen. I think if you certainly look at things like Black Christmas, since we were just talking about it, Jess is not okay at the end of that film. Sally is not okay at the end of of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She is, a laughing maniac, for lack of a better word, just blood soaked. So I don't know, but it is interesting because she is somebody who is so competent and smart and just willing to fight. But I do want to kind of point out, as we're talking about the idea of the final girl, Carol Clover obviously, and I think in our discussion, we've tended to take this road too, is associating the final girl with the slasher film because that's where she is most prevalent. Carol Clover also, for a good portion of her book, talks about her in occult movies. And she uses the word occult. She acknowledges that it's pretty broad. And that I think in that sense, you get even more of the male gaze that we talked about. So for instance, she talks a bit about The Exorcist and how, and we talked about this with our Possession series, where the final girl in that sense is more passive because she is a girl possessed by another entity, and that it's literal men who are fighting over her body. And in that case, I definitely see a straight line back to the Gothic novels because, I mean, you have literally the woman's body being the contested space in that film. But she points out Carrie as being kind of the occult movie that stands out to her as being different because that's more of a female story. Again, for lack of a better term, I'm pulling these male female words from Clover's understanding of gender. But she she pulled a really interesting quote from Carrie where she said, where Carrie's mom accuses her of being like basically in league with Satan. She basically says you're possessed by the devil and wants to like make her pray it away. And she says, it's not Satan's power, it's me. And that's the recognition of the power that's in these female characters that are in slasher films. Again, Carrie's not a slasher film, but I liked what she said there. So I don't know. I feel like that's a really good place for us to kind of draw this to a close because I don't know. I'm really anxious to put Carol Clover's book aside, like now that we because you can't talk about the final girl without talking about Carol Clover and Men, Women, and Chainsaws. But I'm really excited to talk about more instances of the final girl that complicate it because I feel like in the 90s, especially post Scream, things really start to change. And so I don't know. I'm really, really excited for us to jump into that. So I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day or call it a night whenever you're listening to this and say that, I don't know, I feel like we've got a pretty good grasp on who the final girl is and at least where she originated. Or we've pinpointed a few points of where she could have originated that differ a little bit from Carol Clover's, but we did want to give Carol Clover some love since she did come up with the theory and she coined the term final girl. So thank you for that. I don't know if we've missed like a major step along the way in our history of kind of the early history of the final girl. We'd love to know it. And if you listeners can pinpoint an earlier slasher film than Psycho that kind of fits fits what we were talking about and what Carol Clover talks about, I would love to hear it. The more I think about it, I think House of Wax might fit. And that was, because I think that was 53 or around there. It's not a slasher. He doesn't use a knife, but I feel like that could be an earlier one than Psycho, but I don't know. But we would love to hear from you, so feel free to reach out. We would really, really love that. We're on social media at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. Of course, we have a Facebook page as well. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. We have a Patreon where our patrons get exclusive content. But if that's not feasible, you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.